Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. The webinar is about to begin. The book that we're going to be discussing is Wildfire by Sonia Johnson, S-O-N-I-A, discussed by me, Marian Rutigliano. This series of webinars is run by radical feminists whose voices have been canceled or silenced in universities, schools, and media. Frustrated that we cannot share what we know in these places, we are offering this online series of webinars here. Okay, Sonia Johnson. This is the book, Wildfire. She wrote a number of books. She has a handful of videos on YouTube, and you should watch them because she was a very engaging speaker. If you do watch them, Google Sonia Johnson, S-O-N-I-A, Sonia Johnson feminist, because there's apparently a singer named Sonia Johnson, and you don't want the singer, you want the feminist. Biographically, I mean, she wrote her first book in 1981 titled From Housewife to Heretic. I mean, that was a very apt title because this was a woman. She was a housewife. She was a Mormon housewife, had 4 kids, and came to feminism sort of organically. She came to a lot of conclusions before she ever read any feminist works. She just observed and she saw. She was born, raised, married, as I said, in the Mormon Church. She really ardently supported the ERA. For this and for speaking against patriarchy in the Mormon Church and in all religions, really, she was ultimately excommunicated from the Mormon Church. I really recommend finding her talks. Like I said, she was a very engaging speaker, and when she spoke and when she writes, it's kind of like, it's not an academic tome. It's not like she says, here is this idea that I'm developing. It's like talking to someone. You know, it's just like talking to this person, this woman who could be you. She sort of independently came up with the idea that, well, you know, the church, the Mormon Church, all churches really are like patriarchy. I mean, she discovered the word patriarchy, and she came to a lot of conclusions on her own. So when she talks, you know, when you read her books, keep in mind that she'll be talking about something, and then she'll say, but you know, then I decided that was wrong, and here was why. So it's interesting because you can see how she came to conclusions and how she developed her thoughts. So this book, Wildfire, and Igniting the Shevolution, she said, so I'm going to, because she was very conversational, I'm going to actually be reading a lot of her own words. Very, very, very personable. And like I said, it feels like you're just talking to somebody who could be, you know, who could be you. I met her, I saw her speak a few times, and I met her once or twice. And she was really, you know, very, very lovely and animated to talk to. Her argument really was to not only disengage what she called psychically and emotionally from patriarchy and all its institutions, but to detach materially and economically as well. So, I mean, the first chapter was called Who's Afraid of the Supreme Court? At the time when she was writing this, there was this big argument in the Supreme Court about a guy named Robert Bork, who was very anti-abortion, was very, you know, very, very conservative. And she started to argue that, you know, a lot of this stuff, all this stuff that men do in patriarchy, including who they put on the Supreme Court, really doesn't matter. Or does it? What if it really doesn't matter? She starts talking about reality and what reality is, and she uses that term or that idea, reality. It's a little bit confusing until you read for a while and realize that what she's talking about is socialization, and how what we're socialized into becomes what we believe is real. She talks about people coming to think that things that we're socialized to believe have a basis in some underlying reality, that they are natural, that all of patriarchy is real or natural. And we see that in ideas like, you know, it's natural for men to want to, you know, for men to want dominate. It's natural for women to want to be subservient. And when we and she says, and this is like one of the underlying things throughout the book, is that when we stop believing it all, patriarchy is over. The instant enough of us detach from patriarchy and stop facilitating it, that is the instant tyranny will cease. Not a new idea. We see this in other things. Politics of Nonviolent Action by Gene Sharp talks about about people participating and having to consent to tyrants. Our own the American Constitution talks about the consent of the governed. So this is detachment, and this is going to be a recurring theme throughout the book, detachment and the resistance. This is detachment, not resistance. So she says, all through history, women have known intuitively, when not cerebrally, that patriarchy was deadly to everything we loved, and we have always resisted it in every way, overt and covert, private and public, that presented itself the most creative, inventive, imaginative ways possible. And there are countless ways to resist, as we know, on all its levels. Women have resisted patriarchy with unsurpassed cunning, craft, and passion for at least 5,000 years. It should have been obvious to us, and would have been if we hadn't been so deeply conditioned to believe otherwise, that resistance doesn't work. So she goes on to give examples of women, resisting by attacking a fortress. Men have built. She says, men are in this fortress of patriarchy, and we keep trying to assail it. But men just keep finding more inventive and effective ways to keep women out of the ever-strengthening fortress. And she says you can understand this if you're a mom, if you have kids, that resistance really only causes deeper entrenchment. Motherhood should have taught me that resistance only causes deeper entrenchment, she says. Any woman who has had teenagers will testify that when kids are doing something they shouldn't be doing, and the mother nags about it, lectures about it, pleads about it, attacks it. In short, when she makes a federal case of it, the behavior only gets worse, often very creatively worse. Mothers finally learn that resistance is not the way to change kids' behavior, but being the least credible people in patriarchy to ourselves as well as to others, we have a hard time believing that we, in our lowly kitchens, have stumbled upon a principle of human interaction that has cosmic implications. Men use the laws we get them to pass as daggers to stab us in the back. How many lessons do we need before we learn the simple facts of gender-based control? So then she uses the concept of colonized people to talk about what has been happening throughout all these years of patriarchy, and apologies to our British listeners. She uses the example of colonization of places like Nigeria and India, and goes on to say that look at those examples. The feelings in those feelings and perceptions of the colonized people, they tried to make the usurper system work for them, tried to make the colonizer systems work. They struggled to get laws passed that would give them more leeway. And they managed, in some instances, to infiltrate low and even middle-level government echelons and to attain a few managerial and supervisory jobs in the industrial corporate world. A token handful got into the educational institutions reserved for the masters. Some of them regarded these inroads as progress, but enough of them eventually realized that it did not matter what else they seemed to achieve if they did not have home rule. Really important concept. If they did not have home rule, they could never be free. They came to the understanding that freedom was simply not possible for them ever in the colonial system. Freedom meant owning themselves, owning their own lands, using their resources for their own enrichment, making their own laws. What does this mean to us? Women were the first owned, the first ruled people in every race and class and nation, the first slaves, the first colonized people, the first occupied countries. Many thousands of years ago, men took our bodies as their lands. And yikes, that's a pretty that's a pretty profound concept, is that we are colonized. Patriarchy is the colonization of women. And when you colonize, you exploit resources, and our bodies are the resources. So she talks about, I don't, if, for those of you who are old enough and remember, and I don't know what it was like in the UK and in the US, there was a whole women's health initiatives as part of the women's liberation movement in the 70s. Women doing all kinds of stuff like learning to look at their cervixes. I remember, gosh, I forget who it was talking about the first time she did it, or found out, or saw. She started telling other women, it's right there. You look in and it's right there. It's not this, you don't have to go through like, caverns and caves. It's not like a weird, it's just, and it is. I mean, I'm a physician. I've done pelvic exams, and I know it's like, it's, you look and it's like, it's right there. So they learned how to do that. They learned how to do abortions for each other. They learned how to do a lot of that stuff. So in learning to examine our own sexual organs, to diagnose and treat our own cervical and vaginal ailments, to do simple abortions, to deliver babies, and in beginning to think seriously about developing our own safe, effective, natural contraceptives and getting the word out, women were moving out of colonization, out of slavery. We were taking back and learning to govern our own countries. That's like bodily home rule. That our bodies are resources, and we rejected colonization and established home rule over those resources. And she says, in establishing a new order in which women owned their own bodies and were not men's property, they were destroying the very foundation of patriarchy. Since any power over paradigm, hyphenated, having power over other people, since that paradigm is totally dependent upon those on the bottom agreeing to stay there, men's world organization was in grave peril. If women would not be slaves, men could not be masters. And realize that when she talks about this concept throughout the book, this is not victim blaming. It's like, oh, it's victim, it's not. This is absolutely not victim blaming. This is disengagement rather than resistance. And it's really important to just kind of see as she goes on in the book what she means by that and how that plays out. So, think about this. Think about women who say, well, I don't need the women's movement. My husband lets me do anything I want. He lets you. And, I remember her saying in a talk, it's like, your husband lets you. What does that say when somebody lets you do something? That is that's a really, that's a pretty profound thing to think about. If someone lets you. Someone in the chat is talking about disengagement is expensive on a personal level. It absolutely is, and she talks about that and about the risk of it later on in the book. But tyranny is a contract. Both parties have to stick to it. She talked about Roe v. Wade, which had just been passed at the time. This book was published in 1989, so Roe v. Wade had been it was 1973. So Roe v. Wade, it's been pretty much decimated now in the United States. Roe v. Wade was the decision that said that the states couldn't make laws against abortion, and that decision was overturned recently by our Supreme Court. So she talked about Roe v. Wade being very smart politics for men because they let us have abortions. Men, they gave it to us. They let us have abortions, and they would take it away when it no longer served them, which they just have. So then what does she want to tell us? Well, she says, we can't just like think about this. We can't think from bondage into freedom. So she says, what should we do? Let's ask, what should we do? And she gives, and that the answers that we normally come up with are things that we are conditioned or socialized into. But instead, we can think, how do I want to feel? How do I want to be in this new world? these questions are answerable in non-collaborative, change-affecting terms. How shall we be? How shall we feel about ourselves? What kind of a world do we want for ourselves right now? And she thought it was a fundamental feminist principle is that the means are the ends, that how we do something is what we get. Say that again. The means are the ends. How we do something is what we get. And she says, and this is a really hard concept. I mean, the first time I read it, I thought, well, this is kind of strange. Or it's actually the first time I heard it, is that resistance is the profoundest collaboration. If you're fighting with someone, you're very engaged with someone, and it's even more profoundly engaging when the person you're fighting desperately wants you to fight back. That's part of how they want to control you, is by having you fight back. Men say that their goal being peace, for example, naturally they're going to have to bomb and massacre and rape and pillage and torture and lay waste. And then this is the place at which I used to feel as if I were the only person on earth who hadn't caught on. Then suddenly, miraculously, there will come a magical moment, a moment when some sort of alchemy takes place, and voila, peace. Women have always known on some level that there is only one way to have peace, and that is to be peaceful right now. We have understood that because the means are the ends. How we behave is what we get. And that concept of war, it was, bombing and things like that. That is a macrocosm of the microcosm of individual lives, and then the macrocosm again of patriarchy, is that think about a man in his home being, a tyrannical ruler. It's like, you will do this, you will have dinner on a table, keep my home peaceful. Men constantly talk about the purpose of women being to keep the home peaceful, and the man will beat it into the woman if he has to. So what Johnson is talking about is that she wants to make a world where women aren't sacrificing our time and energy, our needs and desires for someone else's better world down the line. This means that this means that if we want a future world in which women are not on our knees pleading with men to be a little kinder, economically, politically, legally, religiously, personally, we must get up off our knees right now. There is no magic moment when groveling suddenly becomes self-respect and independence of spirit. To the degree that this moment we feel independent of men and their system and do not participate in it, we live in a world where patriarchy cannot exist. Men cannot do patriarchy without our fear and dependence. So, and I've heard her say, one of the things she's famous for saying is, keep your eyes off the guys, just keep your eyes off the guys. And certainly in this context, don't beg men. That's part of resistance. And again, think of the abusive man in the home. It's like, oh please don't do that. It's like, and the royal master's like, okay, for right now, but keep my house peaceful. She notes that the fact of women's subordination as a group becomes internalized in individual women as a belief that their personal needs are not important, that to ask for what they want or to get their needs met is selfish, that they are only good and okay if they always put the needs of others first. Indeed, the accusation of selfishness, however subtly communicated, has ironically been perhaps the greatest barrier to women's development of a strong sense of self, which is to be selfish. We see that certainly now when we're told to be kind and inclusive, and all these words that are sort of Trojan horses, because we, otherwise we're selfish. That's that's part of what she was talking about, the reality of that we're socialized into accepting. She makes reference to New Age and New Age values and things like that. And if you weren't living through it, the whole New Age thing that was coming up then was that was sort of the precursor to liberal feminism, precursor to the hyper individualism that we see in postmodernism. That that I can just sit here in the cosmos and live only, just sort of live an existence that is focused on keeping the home peaceful and things like that. It encompassed a lot more things, and I don't want to go into what New Ageism is, but it is what she referred to as the New Age movement, and she said it was politically contextlessness and passive, which it was. It was a whole way of thinking. New Age was blarney. Somebody says in the chat. Yeah, it was. It was a movement that daily subverts the women's movement and steals adherents from it by mimicking women's culture, by glossing the surface with woman-like rhetoric while seething underneath with the same old misogyny. And that's one of the best descriptions I ever heard of, not just of what was termed New Age then, but of a lot of what we call liberal feminism, or I hate the word handmaiden, but a lot of this just deference and constant defending of men. That's kind of what it is. So the idea is that there is no history or context for behavior, and that she said this was very wrong-headed and very dangerous. And she expressed it better than I can by saying that when she speaks of living in the moment in New Ageism, when she speaks of living in the moment, I am not talking about living any old way and saying that any way is as good as any other way. I am not speaking of ignoring or denying political reality, oppression, and pain. I am saying that we must live as if we were free, as if we were in every way the women we have dreamed of becoming, as if the world were as we would wish it to be. And in saying that, I preserve history, provide context, expand the moment to its largest inclusiveness being used correctly. I make judgment a moral necessity. I imply transcendence. She, you have to understand that this is, a basic part of radical feminism, that things are set in the material reality of the world in terms of history and context. She came to a lot of these conclusions. She did certainly do some reading when she was becoming more and more dissatisfied as, this Mormon housewife with 4 kids. But she kind of came up with a lot of this stuff organically, just observing on her own. So to make decisions, we have to, include ideas and include purposefulness based on the reality of history and context, which does require making judgments and saying, yeah, when this happens, this is really a bad thing. This is, when men put on dresses and walk into women's bathrooms, that's a bad thing. That's a judgment, and that's okay. And that's what we do for other women. It's like it's rescuing women. Every day, patriarchy comes for you again, to get your mind and heart again, to destroy you, body and soul. If you cannot extricate yourself from its grasp, if you are imprisoned, how can you expect to free anyone else? The first step is to get free ourselves in all the ways we know are necessary. And as we break free, we make a hole in the paradigm that others can escape through with us. She then goes on to talk about the about freeing ourselves. I use the metaphor of a POW camp, women being patriarchy in the POW camp of patriarchy, and needing to escape from the POW camp. And she goes on to talk about some of the worst excesses of imprisonment, and talks about Hitler. Talks about um, when we try to stop Hitler, in stopping Hitler, we did not in any way impede the propensity for patriarchy to produce Hitlers. There's now a potential Hitler on every street corner and in every women's room in a dress. Did I say that? She said instead, talking about how to really do it differently. Denmark approached this problem. Remember how the problem of anti-Semitism and persecution. Um, Denmark approached the problem with exquisite creativity, not to hide the Jews, because in hiding them, they would have made a world where Jews must be hidden in order to be safe, but to make Jewishness extra visible. Every Dane wore a yellow Star of David, every Dane a Jew. If enough countries had done this, there would have come into being a world in which being visible as a Jew would be the greatest safety. Which is really a very interesting way to look at it. That's just a specific example, but it tells us that our approach and how we create a new world has to be creative. The Danes were not. I mean, they didn't have they didn't erect a fortress. It was a creative solution, detaching from what the Nazis were saying about the Jews. She and this disengagement is a very, very important part. In fact, it's the crux of how she said we really achieve liberation. Involving extricating ourselves from men. And she says, and women don't like to hear this, there were a lot of things that were said and talked about back then that we don't talk about anymore because women find it distressing, because it's controversial, because it's difficult to see, because it's painful. But she says that all women are battered women in patriarchy. Every woman born is in an abusive relationship with men as a class and with their system, since the raison d'etre of all men's institutions, political, legal, educational, religious, economic, and social, is to achieve and perpetuate the slavery of women and the domination of men. It follows that if we can understand what it takes for one woman to extricate herself permanently from a battering situation, we can understand what it will take for all women to extricate ourselves permanently from patriarchy, or brutal relationship with men as a class. Finally, if we can understand what happens to a marriage when a woman finally and unequivocally leaves it, we can predict what will happen when women finally and unequivocally leave our marriage with our husband, the state. And this goes back to something somebody said earlier in the chat, is that it can be very, very expensive to disengage like that, very, very risky. The most risky time for women leaving an abusive relationship individually is when they decide to leave and the man finds out about it. That's when the murders are most likely to happen. That's when the guy is most likely to become violent. And women as a class disengaging from patriarchy, walking away, it is risky. And it can be expensive in terms of how violent men can become. We're seeing this now in the excessively misogynistic backlash that's going on all over the world. So disengagement and walking away can be risky. I mean, think about it. You're talking to a guy and he's like, and I just, after a while, the words become meaningless. But if you just kind of like, whatever, yeah, whatever, that and walk away, every woman knows how much that pisses them off. And it pisses them off in some ways way more than if you tried to argue back or hit them or whatever. So she talks about all the dynamics, in abusive relationship, what men say, how they behave, and just these occasional acts of repentance and humanity, really perfunctory, that seem to be kindness, and because of that, women come to believe that they can transform relationships and somehow change men, small reform by small reform. She clearly talks about Stockholm Syndrome and about Dee Graham's work, her book, wonderful book, Loving to Survive, with Stockholm Syndrome being the emotional bonding of hostages and prisoners of war to their captors. And Johnson says that, all women in patriarchy are long-term POWs, perpetual hostages. We don't like to hear that, but this is not victim blaming. And that eventually, same thing with a woman walking out of an abusive relationship, eventually it's that you become more afraid of not leaving than of leaving. And that's what finally prompts women to leave abusive relationships. And that's what prompts us, hopefully, as a class, as the oppressed class, to leave and simply not engage with patriarchy. So women participated in things like consciousness raising groups. And consciousness raising groups are not group therapy at all, and it's not political analysis, but women found out that other women were going through the same thing. They found out what it was doing to other women's lives that was in common with their lives, and came away with different perceptions, which changed the actions of some individual women. But this needs to translate to women as a group having our macrocosmic marriage, macrocosmic marriage bed, the patriarchal state, so that we would want to leave it. Women leave the microcosm of a patriarchal relationship when they leave husbands. Women as a class, this was the women's liberation movement, the purpose was to leave the macrocosmic marriage bed, patriarchal state. And this is divorce. This comes in a chapter in her book called The Great Divorce. This is divorce, the great divorce of all women for patriarchy. So, but fighting the abusive husband of patriarchy doesn't work. Think about it. Individual relationships, it doesn't work. Macrocosmically, it doesn't work. She concludes that in dominance-oriented conflict in which the aim of the attacker is to dominate the victim, interaction forms the key link. The attacker must have a response from the victim in order to go on. In fact, the attacker craves a response because the response solidifies his control. And again, think about what happens when you do and don't interact. And, I remember I talked once about, interacting with kids. Think about, when a grown man is acting like a kid. Okay, so that's pretty common. And you respond simply by saying, good job. Did you think of that all by yourself? After they're screaming and yelling, and that's just walking away. That's not interacting. So leaving our abusive husband state seems risky to many women. It does. It is. It is hard to overcome the terror-produced belief that we are responsible for men's behavior. So not only is it risky because of potential for violence on an individual level, but we are socialized to believe that somehow if we stayed there and took around and stuck around, we could change their behavior, that somehow we are responsible for their behavior. And women get socialized into that in individual relationships. She talks about this. I have to sacrifice, I have to change him. But we do it on a macrocosmic level as well in the way we respond to patriarchy. And this was, all the more credible, again, when you remember, where she came from, and what her experiences begin. So we wanted to be free. That's what liberation is. It's not equality. We wanted to be free. And because our freedom depends on it, deprogramming ourselves from patriarchy's brainwashing is the single most crucial task before us. It is also the most difficult. To do it, we who have been a domesticated species for thousands of years must recover our wild minds, our thoroughly skeptical and irreverent facilities. We must ask ourselves at least a dozen times a day such questions as, who said so? Who benefits from my thinking this? How does this thought or feeling keep me patriarchy's chattel? How has this idea kept the women's movement securely in men's hands? When I talk with younger women and they talk about, well, I really, I just love really high heels. And I'll ask simple questions like, why? Well, do they feel good? No, but they look, I like the way they look. I love the way they look. And I ask questions like, when did you first think that Who told you that they look good? When did you first hear that? Well, they just look good. And if you keep asking, if the woman is willing to think about it, who told you that they look good first? Who was the first person that told you that? How old were you? Think about it. Think back in your life. Who told you that they look good? Where did that come from? When was the first time you were told that? Um, and and who benefits from you looking good? So that is so that's a really, really important part of thinking about disengaging from the socialization of patriarchy. One of the other things that you talk about, and this is kind of prescient, is that scrutinizing language has been part of this effort to keep us socialized in patriarchy, has been part of this effort from the first. When we deal with language, we engage with symbol, the strongest magic. Feminists understand that one of the subterfuges by which men came to own the world was by appropriating language, embedding messages in it that justified their tyranny, and by doing so, literally changing the face of reality. Wow. That was 1989. And one of the things that's, we see today, that is destroying us almost better than much of what's come before is the male patriarchal possession of language to the point of changing the definition and making people believe that that's reality, changing the definition of what it actually means to be a woman, the ultimate colonization. And she knew, and you read this stuff in 1989 and thought, well, this is really interesting. But now we see it acting out, we see it acting out in reality. So she says, thinking this over, I realized that since men own the language and can name their hanky-panky whatever they wish, obviously they have always tried to name it something highly politic, something with terrific propaganda force. When they cunningly chose power, we believed them. Then looking at the behavior they called powerful and noticing right away that we didn't act like that, we concluded we were powerless. Consequently, we felt powerless. Excuse me. The only way men could ever have been regarded as powerful is by doing what they did, stealing the language and naming weakness power. Excuse me, defining power as ownership and control of others, as the holding of slaves by incalculable violence and terrorism, as the willingness to destroy life. Patriarchy's basis in violence and death is proof of its weakness, if any is needed. Violence is the offspring of weakness, spawned by emotional neediness, feelings of insecurity and powerlessness, worthlessness and fear. The monsters who attacked Kelly J. Keane in New Zealand, that is trying to enact power, trying to be powerful, trying to show that there is power, and the activists remark afterwards that women thought the better of it, were in fear and walked away, and were supposedly in fear of power, but it's not power, it's tremendous weakness. And the language being used to make this this desire for power that the activists have is that somehow we should be more kind and inclusive, like the way women are supposed to be. So power, real power. What's real power? Real power is the generative, positive stuff of life, and because integrity is its source, it cannot destroy or hurt or limit or debase. Power is what women have and have always had. We have always been the generative, positive people on this planet, which is why men have had to redefine and obfuscate the true nature of power. Since genuine power stems from integrity and can exist only in the presence of integrity, women cannot possibly have power in men's misogynist system. And of course, men being misogynists cannot have power either. So engagement with the system is for women a profound betrayal of self. So interesting stuff. Women can only be authentic and truly ourselves outside male systems. Only outside do we really have integrity, and power. So the basic principle of power is, she says, when, and this is again when she uses language in kind of odd ways, and you have to read to see what she's really saying. She said, when we make our feelings of well-being or security or safety dependent upon someone else's behavior, we hand them the opportunity, even the invitation, to destroy us. When someone else, it's if my happiness is dependent upon someone else's behavior, I'm never going to be happy, really, unless, except for those like rare moments when there's a convergence of like, oh, this behavior is fine when I'm in this situation in my life. And that's what she means by disengagement, or part of what she means by disengagement. She tells a story about resistance and confrontation. She tells a story about her teenage son. And I have to laugh because again, I've heard her speak, and she says that she uses examples a lot of dealing with teenagers because she was a mom, and there were a lot of mothers, and she says teenage sons are basically like patriarchy, and men are basically like teenage sons, and so she talks about dealing with her son, and he was ranting about the house, I don't know, about something, and she just kind of basically told him that he would have to, he's old, not a little kid, that he would need to make his decisions. From his mother, she would love him, but she got him to realize that her happiness wasn't going to depend on him being able to rant around the house, and that he would have to make his own decisions for his own life. So that you realize, of course, we're not going to get through this whole book probably. It's very conversational. So we'll get through like really important stuff as much as possible. So somebody talked about trying to walk away from women and our relationships with other women. And she admitted that, women try to destroy each other, destroy one another, often for breaking free. As more and more women find our power and experiment with living in it, however, we would do well to remember how frightened, oppressed people become when some of their group break through to freedom, how well trained all women have been to clamp the fetters around the ankles of any of our kind who give signs of escaping. If we remember that women have been prisoners of war for millennia, we will be more understanding and forgiving of one another when, in our terror bond with patriarchy, we try to destroy one another. This is, again, think of the example of the prisoner of war camp. There are some people in prisoner of war camp who become, I forget what they call them, which is prisoners who have power over the other prisoners and get special privileges from the jailers. That's how they try to escape, and women will resent them for it, really hate them for it. And what they do is harmful to all women, but it's women in terror bonding with patriarchy. So then she talks about justice, and problem with justice. Well, that it's a problem with justice. But one thing about justice, one of the things that's inherent in justice is that there is a component of eye for an eye, authorization of retaliation and revenge. It may be present more in some justice systems and less than in others, but the concept is kind of there. It's external coercion, not self-government. So justice is always a weapon of those in control. And she says, since I don't want justice, what would I propose instead? I want compassion and generosity, first for myself. If I can understand and love myself, I will be merciful and loving to others. If enough of us can deal with ourselves generously and truthfully, kindly, lovingly, mercifully, there will be no need for courts, for laws, for the top-heavy, top-down inherent cruelty of justice. I am tired of being controlled by others. What I want is self-rule. I want true anarchy. I am ready for it. Now, keep in mind that she was felt to be unrealistic, idealist, overly idealistic, kind of a visionary. But that was her vision. And that was her vision for women. And I'm not sure if she thought that men were capable of this. From everything else that I ever heard her say, I suspect she did not think that men were capable of it, but that women could actually achieve this if we disengaged from men. And she talked about equality also, and she was a great proponent of the Equal Rights Amendment, but really understood that equality always involves comparisons, and asked, do we want to be compared to men? Because men always become the standard, that we are compared to. Compare ourselves to men. Should we be equal to men? And when people say it's like, well, don't you want to be equal to men? I'm like, no, that's a demotion. Why would I want to be equal to men? They should want to be equal to us. I don't want to be equal to men. I want them to be equal to women. And she understood that, and that she didn't. That isn't in the book, but almost that exact. I heard her say almost that exact phrase in a talk once. And then there's a long section of the book where she talks about all kinds of different things that that people bring up. It's like, well, what about this? She talks about Western religions. She talks about Eastern philosophies and religions. She says, they may use some more palatable language, but they're just as patriarchal. The New Age movement, patriarchal, religion in general, and that they all fail to examine the political nature of women's oppression and problems. She even talks for a while about Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step programs, and notes that men and women drink for entirely different reasons. Men drink for a sense of power, while women drink out of frustration, helplessness, and dependency, and that can cause some issues for women in recovery. The recovery for men talks a lot about taking responsibility, realizing that how much you have contributed, how much the man has contributed to screwing up the lives of everyone around him. And Alcoholics Anonymous was founded by men, and this is actually stuff that men need to do, but that it's different for women. And then she finally talks about things that we used to talk about a lot in the women's movement, a lot in women's liberation, that are really like powder kegs now that people don't talk about. There's a chapter called Motherhood, the Last Taboo. She says, and remember, this is, Mormon mother of four, talking to a lot of other women who, were moms. Sometimes when I want to break quickly through the social facade of a woman who is a mother, I quietly drop into the conversation something like, motherhood is terrible, isn't it? Although there are always a few who exclaim in shocked tones, oh no, I think it's wonderful. I am surprised how often women will dispense with all pretense and admit, sometimes with tears, that yes, it is terrible. Or look at me in surprise and seeing that I'm serious, admit with relief, it's a nightmare. Some mothers tell me that though their experience has been agonizing, they believe they have learned lessons from it that they could have learned in no other way. I agree that I have learned from it, but any positive lessons I learned, I could have learned in other ways, and the many negative habits patriarchal motherhood reinforced, such as self-sacrifice, I could have done without altogether. Since motherhood was the original battleground of patriarchy, it is small wonder that it is now fraught with tumultuous emotions, contradictions, misperceptions, and illusions, or that there is terrific denial among women about the reality of the motherhood experience. We are afraid that if we speak the truth of our lives as mothers, we will find ourselves standing alone, the unnatural, scorned exception, that if we were to tell what agony motherhood has been for us, women of all political persuasions might fall upon us in rage. So invested are women in keeping the father's last guilty secret, that making motherhood horrific while brainwashing us to believe instead that it is beatific, they have effectively secured our minds and hearts, our cooperation. What is the matter with motherhood? I'm certain that nothing is intrinsically women destroying about it at all, that it could be marvelous for both mothers and children. But something is desperately wrong with motherhood as a patriarchal institution. Patriarchy, after all, arose in history as men's response to the power of women as mothers. Um, so kind of yikes. And then she says, and then turning the screw, they programmed women to believe that motherhood defined us completely, that if we didn't have children, we were nobody. We have been caught in a classic double bind ever since. We are nobody if we are mothers, nobody if we aren't. And one of the things that really disturbs me is conversations where mothers mothers do the best they can. I got to tell you, mothers do the best they can. It is really, it's like a really hard job. But I find discussions very disturbing where mothers are yelling, everybody slams on mothers, everybody gets down on mothers, and where women who don't have children are saying, and everybody, especially mothers, slam on women who don't have children, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Very, very disturbing. Because it really doesn't get to the root. And this is radical feminism, the root. And this is what Sonia Johnson was talking about. She talks about about childcare centers and why and it allowed women to work outside the home. But she says, how can we approach this? What can we do about this? Or what about childcare? Well, we can begin, as we have, to ask the world-changing questions. What do we value? How do we want to live? What kinds of work really need to be done? How many hours a day of work would that take per person? How could we organize society so that everyone's needs could be met? Only useful and helpful work would be done, and everyone would have time to live. She says that if we choose to be mothers, we have no choice but to organize our world as it needs to be for mothers and children alike. The most obvious and crucial part of our living in a new feminist society will be that we make taking women and children seriously our first priority, that we treat them as the sacred, holy ones they are. Mothering, she says, is the business of making the world amenable to children. So we used to talk about this a lot more. And somebody said, yeah, I regret that. There was an advice columnist named Ann Landers a number of years ago in the United States. And she did a poll once of just a totally anonymous poll of thousands of women across the country. And 70% of women said that they regretted having kids and would never do it again. And she published it, and she got, here's Ann Landers, advice columnist. She really got a lot of flack for publishing that poll, and people didn't believe her, and so that was kind of eye-opening. Mothers do the best they can. They really do. And she recognized that, but she has a chapter in here that again is something that we used to talk about, but we don't anymore. Chapter is Rearing Nice Sons Can't Change the World. When I touch on the problem with women who have already born sons, they assure me that I needn't worry, that they will rear their boys so differently, turn them into such a new breed of men that the world will be changed. I'm certain that when they say this, they are utterly sincere and well-meaning. I am certain that they have no intention of insulting the vast rest of us, living and dead, who have had sons we were not able to turn into a new breed of men. I'm equally certain that they believe they will succeed where hundreds of generations of us have failed. But it still hurts me that they so thoughtlessly participate in this unconscious blaming of all previous mothers for the wretched condition of the world. I'm not sure that that's really what they're saying, but that's what she says. I am surprised that they believe that women can change the basic formative fact of men's lives, which is that every man born automatically has violence-based and perpetuated privilege. That doesn't change by rearing sons to be pro-feminist. There is, at present, no way to be a man that is both acceptable to the mothers as well as the fathers. Guess who wins? Despite our best efforts, sons are male, and to be male in patriarchy means to have automatic privilege in relation to the females of one's group. privilege one gets only through unceasing male violence and terrorism against them, and male socialization that starts from the day a boy is born. Until this is no longer true, our sons will be characteristically damaged by patriarchy no matter what we do. Until this is no longer true, it doesn't matter how hard we try to teach our sons another way of being men. They will in some ways still be monsters, some less monstrous than others, but all monstrous. Um, Controversial stuff. We used to talk about this all the time. We don't anymore because it's so disturbing. And this is the reason, she says, that women's raising sons has not changed the world. Not because mothers didn't want passionately for our sons to be decent, loving, and good, and to do everything we could think of to bring that about, but because by its very nature, having privilege at others' expense renders one unable to be fully decent, loving, and good. This is the reason feminists rearing sons can never change the world. We must simply give up forever the idea that we can change anything through someone else, our sons, our husbands, any man, any other woman. We can only change ourselves. She says, that's it. That's the revolution. She calls it a she-volution. The the subtitle of the book, the she-volution. And then there are a bunch of chapters in the end, which are kind of just a lot of other thoughts. Mostly talking about just this paradigm shift of living outside the patriarchy. And she finally says near the end of this, she talks about separatism and absolutely admits that separatism involves a great deal of risks. A great deal of risks to separate from patriarchy. She understands that, but believes that there is really no other way. And finally says that women say fearfully, but men own all the resources. We've got to get them from them in order to live. But there's only one condition in which this is entirely true, and that is if we stay in their system. So long as we remain slaves, men do own all the resources. When we escape, we take ourselves, their primary resources, with us for their own enrichment. Think about that. We are the resources. Men have all the resources. We are the resources. Men's power comes through the resources. We are the resources. And if we take the resources away, they lose power. They have no power, and that's what ultimate power is this disengagement. I don't know if there's any questions. I don't see any questions. Lots of stuff in the chat. Again, great book. Very, very conversational. That's why I chose to just sort of read what she said, because this is somebody she's like you, she's like me, she's like us. She urge you to look at her handful of videos. Remember, Sonia Johnson, feminist, because there's a singer, Sonia Johnson, SONIA. So Sonia Johnson, feminist. And her ultimate thing that she kept saying in terms of expressing disengagement is take your eyes off the guys. And it didn't just mean, sexually or being attracted to them. It meant in every way. It meant withdrawing resources. We are the resources. Take your eyes off the guys. Thanks, everybody.